All right, get ready to dive into a period of Indian history that's absolutely fascinating. We're talking about the rise of militant nationalism from 1905 to 1917.
It's amazing these people weren't just going against British rule, like some abstract idea.
Right?
They were dealing with very specific events and policies, things that really sparked a huge resistance.
Yeah, so let's go back to the early 1900s.
Okay.
We've got the Swadeshi movement going on.
Yeah.
A lot of people see it as a big, important step towards this more militant kind of nationalism, right?
Absolutely. The Swadeshi movement went from 1905 to 1909, and it was basically a reaction to what the British government did. They decided to partition Bengal.
Oh, yeah. The British probably thought they were being really smart,
Right.
dividing Bengal to weaken the nationalists.
Yeah.
But didn't that completely backfire?
It totally did. Bengal was like a hotbed for nationalist feelings, and this partition, everybody saw it as a way to break the region apart, undermine its power,
Yeah.
It really brought Indians together across religious and social lines. Suddenly, it wasn't just about Bengal anymore. It was about unity, about deciding your own future.
Right. And that's when we see Swadeshi, which means of one's own country, become this huge rallying cry.
Exactly. The movement was all about boycotting British goods. Everything. Textiles, salt. It was about economic resistance. But it went deeper than that. It really helped indigenous industries grow. A sense of national pride started to bloom.
It's in our source material. The Swadeshi movement wasn't just about what people bought or didn't buy.
Yeah.
It was about how they got organized, how they made their voices heard. We see all these new ways of political action popping up. Mass meetings, boycotts,
Right.
even what we might call civil disobedience starting to happen.
Right. And later on, those who were taking more of a militant approach, they adopted these tactics and made them even better. But it's important to remember, the Swadeshi movement, well, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There was a growing rift in the Indian National Congress. That was the leading nationalist organization back then.
Oh yeah, the big split between the moderates and the extremists. 1907, the Surat session. It was a huge clash of ideologies.
Yeah, the main issue was how far the boycott movement should go. The moderates thought it was best to appeal to the good nature of the British. They wanted to work within the system, hoping for gradual reforms. They wanted to keep the boycott limited to Bengal, focus mostly on certain goods like foreign cloth and liquor.
So a more careful approach, thinking they could convince the British to make some concessions.
Right, exactly. But the extremists, people like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandra Pal, they had a completely different vision. They wanted a total break immediately with the British. They wanted a nationwide boycott. They said no association with the British government at all, including schools, courts, legislative councils. They truly believed that real freedom, Swaraj, could only come through complete independence.
Wow. So it wasn't just about the boycott itself, was it? It was about two completely different visions for what India should become.
Exactly right. And because they disagreed so fundamentally, it led to this dramatic split in the Congress. The extremists ended up being expelled.
It seems like the way the British reacted just made things worse, pushed some people towards even more extreme methods.
Absolutely. The British were really alarmed by how strong the nationalist movement was getting. They responded by getting really repressive, enacting all kinds of laws to stop people from speaking out, curtailing their activities.
Our source mentions things like the Seditious Meetings Act, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, even the Newspapers Act.
Yeah.
It seems like they were trying to clamp down on every single conversation.
They wanted to silence any opposition and stay in power, but it backfired. Instead of calming things down, the repression just made people feel more urgent, made a lot of them think peaceful protest wasn't going to work. And this is when things started to shift. More militant resistance, especially in Bengal.
It seems like Bengal's always leading these movements.
It's true. Bengal had this rich intellectual history, this cultural energy. It was already a place where nationalist feelings ran strong. And then the British partition, that just made it even more intense. Perfect conditions for revolutionary groups to appear.
And that's where we see two key organizations pop up, the Anushalan Samiti and Jugantar. They're highlighted in our source. What made them different?
They flat out rejected what the moderates were doing, all that appealing and petitioning. They believed that only armed struggle was the way to get independence.
Wow. So they were ready to risk it all for what they believed in. That takes serious commitment. What made them tick? What were their ideologies like?
A deep, deep love for their country drove them. A burning desire for a free India. Their ideologies, they came from all over the place. Ancient Indian scriptures, the Italian Risorgimento, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, even writings from European anarchists. They believed in the power of heroic action, one person doing something amazing to awaken everyone else and spark this nationwide uprising against the British.
Yeah. They weren't just talking about revolution. They were planning and carrying out attacks. Our source talks about a bunch of these actions.
Right. One of the first ones was in 1907. They tried to assassinate a British official named Sir Fuller. He was really unpopular. And then later that same year, they tried to derail a train carrying the lieutenant governor, Sir Andrew Fraser.
So it seems like they were going after specific people who represented British oppression, like symbols.
That's right. The idea was to make the rulers scared, show them that the British could be defeated. Then there was the Muzaffarpur bombing in 1908. Two young revolutionaries, Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chakki. They wanted to kill a British judge, Kingsford, who was known for giving really harsh sentences to nationalist activists.
Oh, but I remember reading they ended up accidentally killing two British women instead. And that caused this huge crackdown.
Yeah, the Alipore bomb case of 1908, that came directly from this incident. It ended up implicating big names like Aurobindo Ghosh and his brother Barindra.
And during the trial, right there in the jail, two prisoners, Satyendranath Bose and Kanal Dutta, they shot and killed the main witness. Talk about dramatic.
It really shows how desperate they were, how far they were willing to go. But it wasn't just about assassinations. They did these things called Swadeshi dacoity.
Swadeshi dacoities, what are those?
They were basically robberies. They targeted government money or wealthy people who were connected to the British. They wanted to get funds to finance their activities and hurt the British economy.
That's wild. Did it work? Were these Swadeshi dacoities effective?
Well, they were definitely daring, and sometimes, yeah, they managed to get a lot of money, like the Burr dacoity in 1908, organized by the Dhaka Anushilin Group.
But probably the most daring thing they did was the Delhi conspiracy case of 1912, that attempt to assassinate Lord Hardinge,
Right.
the Viceroy of India.
Raj Bahari Bose and Sachin Sanyal, they planned this super bold attack, threw a bomb at Lord Hardinge during his state entry into Delhi.
And Hardinge, he survived, but it must have completely shaken up the British. Our source mentions how Raj Bahari Bose actually escaped by disguising himself. A true escape artist.
He was amazing at getting away, a key figure in connecting all these revolutionary groups across the country. But while Bengal was a hotbed, similar movements were gaining steam in other parts of India, too.
Yeah, let's talk about those other regions. Our source talks about Maharashtra and Punjab as big centers of militant nationalism.
In Maharashtra, you can see the early revolutionary ideas with Vasudev Balwant Phadke. He formed the Ramosi Peasant Force back in 1879. They were some of the first to say, hey, we should fight the British with weapons.
And then there's Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He really got the nationalist movement going in Maharashtra.
Oh, yeah. Tilak was this powerful speaker, a brilliant journalist. His newspapers, Kasari and Maratha, they were huge in spreading nationalist ideas and challenging the British. He used the legacy of Shivaji, that Maratha warrior king from the 1600s, as a symbol of fighting back against foreign rule. And his famous slogan, Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it, it became a battle cry for nationalists all across India.
His influence, you can definitely see it in what the Chapekar brothers did, Damodar and Balkrishna. They killed two British officials back in 1897.
Yeah, they did that because of how the British government handled a plague in Poon. People thought it was insensitive and really heavy-handed. That incident, it was a turning point for Maharashtra's nationalist movement. It showed that even with the British being so powerful, people were still willing to go to extremes to resist them.
And then there's Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, another big figure in Maharashtra's militant nationalist movement. He started the Abhinav Bharat Society, a secret organization inspired by revolutions in Europe.
Savarkar really believed in complete independence and thought armed revolution was the only way to get it.
And his group was involved in the Nasik conspiracy case of 1909, right?
That's right. A member of Abhinav Bharat assassinated A.M.T. Jackson, the collector of Nasik. That's what led to the case. Savarkar was implicated and sentenced to be transported for life. All these things happening in Maharashtra just show how the spirit of militant nationalism wasn't limited to Bengal. It was spreading, taking root in different places, inspiring all kinds of people to join the fight for freedom.
Right, it wasn't just Maharashtra either. Our source also points to Punjab as a hotbed of revolutionary activity. We've got figures like Lala Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh mobilizing people there.
Lala Lajpat Rai, they called him the Lion of Punjab. He was this really charismatic leader, a powerful voice for social and political reform.
Right.
He and Ajit Singh, who's Bhagat Singh's uncle, They founded the Anjuman-e-Mohizban-e-Watan, a group of extremists. They believed in complete independence, and they were ready to use any means necessary to achieve it.
Yeah, our source says a few things came together to fuel this rise of extremism in Punjab. Famines, those land revenue policies that really hurt the peasantry, and even what was going on in Bengal, it served as a kind of inspiration.
It all created a sense of urgency. People started to think moderate approaches were useless. Then the British cracked down on nationalist activities in Punjab. They even deported Lajpat Rai and Ajit Singh in 1907. That just made the belief in extremism even stronger.
So we see these little pockets of revolution popping up all over India, all sparked by local problems, but they're all united by this one goal.
Yeah.
Kick out the British.
And that brings us to something crucial about this whole militant nationalist movement. It wasn't just happening within India.
Oh, interesting.
They were building connections abroad, trying to get support, resources, even inspiration from other anti-colonial movements.
This is where it gets really exciting. Tell me about these international connections. Our source specifically mentions Shyamji Krishnavarma's India House in London.
India House was founded in 1905. It became this hub for radical Indian students and activists living in London. Krishnavarma, he was a hardcore nationalist. He believed that India could only be truly free if it completely separated from Britain. He gave these people money, intellectual support, and many of them went on to play big roles in the revolution back home.
Some pretty big names were associated with India House, right? Like Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, we talked about earlier, and Lala Hardayal, another big figure in the militant nationalist movement.
Yeah, Savarkar, while he was at India House, he wrote this really influential book, The Indian War of Independence, 1857.
Okay.
It presented the 1857 uprising as this heroic fight for freedom. It was banned in India, but revolutionaries circulated it widely. It really fueled their desire for independence.
India House was also connected to the assassination of Curzon Willie, a British official, by Madan Lal Dhingra in 1909. Dhingra's act, while a lot of people condemned it, it really shook up British society and brought a lot of attention to what Indian revolutionaries were doing in London.
The incident really showed how frustrated and angry Indian revolutionaries were getting with British rule. They weren't happy just asking for reforms anymore. They were ready to take action, even if it meant using violence.
But London wasn't the only place where revolutionary activity was happening abroad. Our source also mentions Madame Bakaji Kama and her work in Paris and Geneva.
Bakaji Kama was an amazing woman. She was a fierce advocate for India's independence, a true pioneer. She challenged colonial rule and gender norms. She escaped British surveillance in India and went to Europe.
Right.
There she connected with French socialists and other anti-colonial activists.
She even designed the first version of India's national flag, the one she unfurled at the International Socialist Congress in Stuttgart in 1907.
Yeah, that was a statement. She worked so hard for India's freedom, publishing revolutionary writings, giving speeches, organizing protests all over Europe. She helped to bring the fight for India's independence to the world stage, getting support from like-minded people and organizations everywhere.
Yeah, I think the most impactful international movement during this time was the Gadra Party.
Yeah.
Founded in 1913 in San Francisco. What made it so important?
The Gadra Party, it means mutiny or rebellion. It represented this truly global dimension of the Indian nationalist movement. It was mostly made up of Punjabi Sikh and Muslim immigrants who'd settled on the west coast of North America.
Right.
A lot of them had faced discrimination and hardship in their new countries.
Yeah.
And that really fueled their anger towards British rule.
The Gadra movement was a powerful expression of diasporic nationalism. It shows how the desire for India's freedom went way beyond borders.
The Gajrites were driven by this powerful mix of nationalism, anti-colonialism, and a desire for social justice. They had a weekly newspaper called Gadar, which spread their revolutionary ideas and called for an armed uprising against the British Raj. Their message hit home with Punjabi communities worldwide, especially those who had experienced the injustices of British colonialism firsthand.
Our source mentions some key people associated with the Gadar Party. Lala Hardayal, Ramchandra, Bhagwan Singh, Kartar Singh Saraba, Barkatullah, and Bhai Parmanan. What connected all of them?
They were all united by this unwavering commitment to India's freedom. They believed that armed revolution was the only way to achieve it. They traveled all over the place, organizing chapters of the Gadar Party, spreading their message of revolution among Indian communities across the world.
And their goal was clear: overthrow British rule through a coordinated armed rebellion.
Exactly. They thought that if uprisings happened all across India at the same time, with help from Indian soldiers in the British Army, it would be the best way to bring down the British Empire. They actively tried to recruit Indian soldiers stationed abroad, emphasizing that they were all in this together, regardless of religion or region.
They even published revolutionary writings in multiple languages, spreading them to Indian troops and communities abroad. Their newspaper, Kadra, it played a huge role in getting those revolutionary ideas out there. It was printed in Urdu, Punjabi, Hindi, even in English. They wanted to reach everyone.
Absolutely. And then two major things happened in 1914 that pushed their plans forward: the Komagata incident and the start of World War I.
Yeah, the Komagata incident, it's a classic example of discriminatory immigration policies, and it really impacted the Gadaru movement. It fueled a lot of resentment among Sikhs, both in Canada and Punjab.
Yeah, the Komagata was a Japanese steamship. It had over 370 passengers on board, most of them Sikh immigrants from Punjab who were trying to immigrate to Canada. But when they got to Vancouver, they weren't allowed in, because of these blatantly discriminatory immigration laws that targeted South Asians.
It's a really shameful part of Canadian history. Even though they had valid travel documents, they were basically trapped on the ship for months in terrible conditions, fighting legal battles.
It was such an obvious injustice. It sparked outrage, not just among the passengers, but among Indian communities all over the world. The Komagata had to go back to India, and when it got to Calcutta, the passengers were met with even more hostility from the British authorities.
A clash with police at Budge. Budge ended up killing several passengers. A terrible tragedy that really affected the Sikh community. It showed the hypocrisy of the British, all their talk about justice and equality.
For a lot of people in the Gadaru movement, this was a turning point. It showed them that British colonialism was all about racial prejudice and exploitation, no matter where you were in the world.
And then World War I breaks out in August 1914. It must have seemed like an opportunity for the Gadarites.
Oh, the war changed everything. The Gadarites saw it as their chance to strike at the heart of the British Empire. They figured Britain is busy with this huge war in Europe, so their control over India has to be weaker.
So they told their members to go back to India and get ready for an uprising, hoping to take advantage of this moment of weakness.
Exactly. They smuggled weapons and ammunition into India, made contact with revolutionary groups in the country.
Wow.
Even plotted to get soldiers in the British Indian Army to mutiny. They thought a coordinated effort hitting multiple places at once would have the biggest impact.
Our source talks about Kartar Singh Sarabha and Raghubar Dayal Gupta as key figures who went to India to lead this planned uprising.
They worked nonstop to rally support, coordinating with revolutionary networks in Punjab and Bengal. They even contacted Rash Behari Bose, who we talked about earlier, and Sachin Senyal, who was already active in Bengal, to help lead the movement.
It sounds like they were planning this huge multi-pronged attack on British rule.
They even robbed wealthy people and government treasuries, what they called political dacoities, to fund their operations.
And these political dacoities, they often targeted moneylenders and debt records. It's like there was a social dimension to their revolution.
Yeah, they wanted more than just national liberation. They wanted to fix social injustices, make life better for ordinary Indians.
Right. So their vision of a free India wasn't just about getting rid of the British.
No.
It was about equality and dignity for everyone, free from foreign rule and oppressive social structures. They had it all set for this massive rebellion, February 21st, 1915.
The date was set.
So, did they succeed?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Did they pull it off? Well, as you might guess, things don't always go as planned, especially when you're talking about revolutions.
Yeah, we left off with all these revolutionaries ready to go, arms smuggled in, the date set. So what happened?
The uprising was supposed to happen February 21st, 1915, but sadly it fell apart before it could even really get going. There were betrayals, leaks within the movement. The British found out and cracked down hard.
Oh man, the classic story. Spies, informants, loose lips, sinking ships. Seems like it happens in every revolution.
It definitely shows you how hard it is to keep things secret, especially when you're up against a powerful enemy like the British Empire.
So what was the crackdown like? How did the British react?
Oh, they were swift and brutal. Thousands of suspected revolutionaries were arrested and detained. Martial law was imposed in Punjab, and they enacted the Defense of India Act. It basically gave them unlimited power to crush any dissent.
Our source mentions the Defense of India Act. It sounds pretty harsh.
It was. They could detain people without trial, censor the press, stop public gatherings. It was a dark time for the nationalist movement. A lot of revolutionaries were executed, imprisoned, or forced into exile.
A reminder that fighting for freedom often comes with a huge personal cost.
It does. And one of those key figures we talked about, Rash Behari Bose, he saw the danger coming and managed to escape to Japan. He'd go on to play a big role in the Indian National Army during World War II, but that's another story for another time.
Yeah, definitely. So the Ghadar rebellion failed, but did it achieve anything?
Even though it failed, it taught valuable lessons to those who still believed in India's independence.
It's like they say, sometimes failure is the best teacher.
It definitely forces you to rethink your strategies. The Goddards learned the hard way about how important internal security is. They needed better coordination, and relying too much on help from outside was risky.
So the Ghadarites didn't reach their goal, but their efforts weren't completely wasted. They left a legacy of resistance that would inspire others later on. But our source mentions that things calmed down a bit after World War I. Why was there this lull in revolutionary activity?
A few things contributed to that. First, a lot of political prisoners were released after the war. It gave people a sense of hope. Second, the British government, they might have realized they needed to do something about the problems that were fueling all this nationalism.
Okay.
So they started making promises about constitutional reforms, kind of like a carrot and stick approach.
Right, give them a little something to keep them quiet.
Exactly. And finally, Mahatma Gandhi enters the political scene. He advocated for a completely new approach, nonviolent non-cooperation. It really changed the whole landscape of Indian nationalism.
Yeah, a lot of people see Gandhi as a turning point in India's fight for independence. What happened to the revolutionaries? Did they just fade away?
Not at all. They were regrouping, thinking about new strategies, learning from their mistakes. The Ghadar movement may not have reached its goals, but it provided important lessons.
So it wasn't in either thing. It wasn't either militant nationalism or Gandhi's nonviolent movement. It was more complex than that.
Absolutely. The story of India's independence is multifaceted. It's a tapestry, woven from different threads, each representing a different approach, a different ideology, a different set of tactics.
So how did the revolutionaries adapt to this new situation? How did their tactics change as they faced new challenges?
They had to go underground, became more secretive, focused on building secret networks, and they were more careful about who they targeted. Instead of big dramatic uprisings, they went for smaller, more precise actions, things that would disrupt the British administration and wear down their forces.
So instead of making big, sweeping statements, they went for more surgical strikes.
Exactly. We see a rise in what you might call urban guerrilla warfare, killing important officials, sabotaging government infrastructure, raiding police stations to get weapons.
Our source doesn't give specific examples for this period, but I've read other historical accounts about revolutionary groups like the Hindustan Republican Association,
Right.
or HRA,
Right.
formed in the 1920s. They really embodied this new approach.
The HRA was a significant development in the militant nationalist movement. They were all about secrecy, discipline, and they were really influenced by socialist ideas. They thought a revolution needed to be organized, strategic.
But wouldn't those smaller actions risk alienating the masses? Wouldn't people see them as just random acts of violence, not part of a bigger fight for freedom?
That's a good point, and this is where propaganda became really important. The revolutionary groups knew that winning people over was just as important as any military action. They had to get their message out, build public support for their cause.
So it wasn't just bombs and bullets for them. They knew how powerful words and images could be.
They published newspapers, pamphlets, even staged big public events. They wanted to expose British atrocities, celebrate their heroes, and inspire ordinary people to join them. They knew they had to shape the narrative, control the message.
This makes me think of Bhagat Singh. He and his comrades in the HRA were masters of using propaganda.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh.
Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Rajguru, they were incredibly charismatic, and they could really speak their minds. They were deeply influenced by socialist ideas and driven by a vision of a free and equal India.
They used their actions, like when they bombed the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi in 1929, to not just strike a blow against the British, but to highlight their demands for complete independence and social justice.
They were willing to die for what they believed in. They used their trials and imprisonment as platforms to talk about their vision and rally public support. Their defiance, their eloquence, and their willingness to sacrifice their lives for their ideals, it captivated the nation.
So even with Gandhi's nonviolent movement gaining momentum, the revolutionaries were still out there, fighting British rule with different tactics. It's interesting how these two approaches, seemingly so different, weren't always completely separate.
You're right. Many people, especially young people, were drawn to both Gandhi's message of nonviolent resistance and the revolutionaries' call for complete independence. They saw both as important, both playing a role in weakening British rule.
It sounds like there wasn't just one way to resist. It was a spectrum. with different groups and individuals choosing their own methods based on their beliefs and their situation.
That's it. And this mix of tactics, this blend of approaches, it's what makes this period so interesting. It reminds us that revolutions are rarely straightforward. They're messy, complex, and driven by a lot of different motivations and ideologies.
We've talked a lot about the revolutionaries and their tactics, but what about the British? How did they respond to this changing landscape of resistance?
Well, at first, they reacted with repression, as you might expect. We've already talked about those harsh laws they passed, like the Defense of India Act. They gave the police more power and cracked down on any kind of dissent. But as time went on, they realized that using force wasn't enough to stop the nationalist movement, which was growing stronger all the time. They needed a new plan.
So the Iron Fist wasn't working. What did they try instead?
They tried to be more conciliatory, at least on the surface. They started offering some concessions, promising reforms, and trying to divide the nationalist movement by turning different groups against each other. The classic divide and rule strategy.
Right, make them fight amongst themselves.
Exactly. Our source mentions the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 as an example of this strategy. Those reforms seemed progressive, but they were really designed to keep the British in control. They introduced elections for legislative councils, but with separate electorates for Muslims.
So it was kind of a trick, looking like they were giving something while actually trying to cause division and hold on to power. Did it work?
Not really. Those reforms, instead of calming the nationalists down, just made them want more autonomy and eventually complete independence. It seemed like no matter what the British did, they were always a step behind. The nationalist movement, in all its different forms, was gaining momentum, and the demand for Swaraj was getting louder every year.
And this brings us to a really important turning point in India's journey towards independence. Mahatma Gandhi arrives on the scene.
Gandhi coming in as a leader really changed everything for Indian nationalism. He brought this new philosophy, new tactics, a new vision for a free India.
Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, or satyagraha, it seems so different from the militant nationalism we've been talking about. But is it really that simple?
It's more complicated than that. Gandhi and the militant nationalists, they both wanted the same thing in the end, to be free of British rule. They just disagreed on how to get there.
Okay, so same destination, different roads.
Right. Think of it like two rivers flowing towards the same ocean. They might take different paths, have different tributaries, but they're both headed to the same place.
I like that. So how did Gandhi's approach affect the militant nationalist movement?
Gandhi was brilliant at tapping into the discontent that was all over India. He turned that energy into a massive movement that brought together people of all religions and social backgrounds. He gave people a way to resist the British without using violence.
His idea of non-cooperation, boycotting British institutions, their goods, their services, it resonated with people who were already familiar with Swadeshi from the earlier Swadeshi movement.
You got it. He built on what came before him, took those ideas of self-reliance and resistance and turned them into a powerful new form of non-violent struggle.
And all those people, millions of them, out on the streets, that must have put immense pressure on the British.
It did. Gandhi's tactics were really effective. The Salt March in 1930 is a great example. It was a simple act of defiance against the British salt tax, but it captured the attention of the entire world. It showed everyone the power of nonviolent resistance. The British had to face reality. Their control over India was slipping away. No amount of force could stop a nation united in its demand for freedom.
But even with Gandhi's movement getting stronger, those who believed in more militant forms of resistance, they didn't just go away, did they?
No, they didn't. Groups like the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, the HSRA, they kept going throughout the 1920s and 30s. They might have focused on smaller operations like targeted assassinations and sabotage, but they were still just as committed to complete independence.
And people like Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru, they kept inspiring a whole new generation of revolutionaries.
They were the embodiment of defiance. They were willing to give up everything for what they believed in. Their actions, their writing, and their martyrdom, they turned them into powerful symbols of resistance.
So, India's fight for independence. It wasn't a simple choice between Gandhi's nonviolence and the more militant approaches. It was a mix of these different strands, each one playing a part in the goal of freedom.
Exactly. And we need to remember that these approaches weren't always completely separate. Some people were drawn to both Gandhi's message and the revolutionaries' call for total independence. They saw them as working together, each weakening the British grip on India in its own way.
It shows us that history is rarely black and white. It's messy, it's complicated, and is often driven by things that are hard to categorize. But what about the British? How did they react to this increasingly complex and powerful nationalist movement?
Well, like we talked about, their first instinct was to crack down, pass those harsh laws, give more power to the police, try to break up the nationalist movement. But as the fight for independence gained momentum, they knew they needed a new plan.
So just being tough wasn't enough anymore. What did they do instead?
They started offering some concessions, promising reforms, and trying to negotiate with nationalist leaders. Basically, they were trying to stall, hoping to delay what they knew was coming. But it was too late. The demand for Swaraj was just too strong to contain.
And then, to make things even more complicated, World War II breaks out. How did this global conflict affect things in India?
The war created both problems and opportunities for the Indian nationalist movement. On one hand, the British were fighting for their lives against Nazi Germany, and they needed India's help. They needed India's resources, its manpower, and its strategic location to fight this global war.
But that put Indian leaders in a tough spot. How could they support a war for freedom and democracy somewhere else when they were being denied those same rights at home?
It was a powerful argument, and it made the nationalist movement even stronger. In 1942, Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, demanding immediate independence. Even though the British tried to crush it, the movement weakened their hold on India and showed that their time was running out.
And the war itself showed that the British Empire wasn't invincible. They were losing in Southeast Asia. That myth of their power was shattered.
And the rise of Japan as a powerful force in Asia gave new hope to those who wanted complete and immediate independence. This is where we see figures like Subhas Chandra Bose coming onto the scene.
Bose is a fascinating guy. And a bit controversial, too.
He was. He didn't believe in Gandhi's nonviolent approach. He escaped from house arrest in India and went to Southeast Asia looking for support from the Japanese. He formed the Indian National Army, the INA, with the goal of liberating India by force.
The INA, even though it didn't succeed militarily, it still played an important part in India's fight for independence.
It showed just how far Indians were willing to go to be free. And it put pressure on the British, made them realize that their empire was falling apart.
By the end of World War II in 1945, it was pretty clear that the world had changed. The age of colonialism was over. The British were exhausted from the war and couldn't hold on to their empire anymore.
They knew it was over. Negotiations for independence started, and in 1947, the Indian Independence Act was passed. It was a moment of victory, a testament to all the years of struggle and sacrifice by so many people who had fought for their dream of a free India.
But it wasn't a perfect victory, was it?
No, it wasn't. The joy of independence was mixed with the tragedy of partition, dividing British India into two separate nations. India and Pakistan was done too quickly and without enough planning. It led to mass displacement, violence, and communal conflict. It left a deep scar on the subcontinent, a wound that still affects the region today.
It reminds us that even the greatest victories can come with a high price.
It does.
Welcome back. We're right in the middle of India's fight for independence, and things are about to get even more intense. We've got those militant nationalists going head-to-head with the British. And now, Mahatma Gandhi enters the scene, a figure who had totally changed this movement.
Yeah, Gandhi's arrival is a huge turning point. He brings this philosophy of satyagraha. It's this powerful mix of truth and nonviolent resistance. It would capture the hearts and minds of millions of Indians.
So we've got this revolutionary energy, bombs exploding, secret groups plotting, and then Gandhi walks in talking about peace and nonviolence.
Yeah.
How did those two seemingly opposite forces interact? Was it like a clash of the titans?
Not really. I think it's important to remember that both Gandhi and the militant nationalists, they were fighting for the same thing in the end. Freedom from British rule. They just had different ideas about how to achieve it.
Okay, so same goal, different paths.
Exactly. Imagine two rivers flowing to the same ocean. They might have different currents, different tributaries, but they're both ending up in the same place.
I like that. So how did Gandhi's way of doing things affect the militant nationalist movement?
Well, Gandhi was amazing at tapping into all that unrest that was building up across India.
Yeah.
He channeled that energy into a massive movement that crossed all those religious and social divides. He gave people a way to resist the British without having to resort to violence.
And his message of non-cooperation, boycotting British institutions, their goods, their services, that resonated with people who already knew about Swadeshi from that earlier Swadeshi movement.
Exactly. He was building on what those before him had started. He took those ideas of self-reliance and resistance and turned them into this powerful new form of nonviolent struggle.
And all those people, millions of them coming out onto the streets, it must have put incredible pressure on the British.
It did. Gandhi's tactics worked. The Salt March in 1930, that's a great example.
Oh, yeah.
It was a simple act, defying the British salt tax, but it caught the world's attention. It showed everyone how powerful nonviolent resistance could be. The British had to face it. Their control over India was slipping away. There was no way they could hold on, no matter how much force they used.
But even though Gandhi's movement was gaining strength, the people who believed in more militant resistance, they didn't just vanish, did they?
They didn't. Groups like the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, the HSRA, they were active all through the 1920s and 30s. They might have shifted to smaller actions, more focused, like assassinations or sabotage, but their commitment to complete independence, that was just as strong as ever.
And people like Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, and Rajguru, they were still inspiring a whole generation of revolutionaries.
They were. They embodied that spirit of defiance, that willingness to sacrifice everything for their ideals. Their actions, their writing, and then their martyrdom, it made them incredibly powerful symbols of resistance.
So it wasn't a simple choice between Gandhi's nonviolence and the more militant approaches. It was this complex mix, with each contributing to the goal of freedom.
Right. And it's really important to remember that these approaches weren't always mutually exclusive. Many individuals were drawn to both Gandhi's message and the call for complete independence from the revolutionaries. They saw both as important, each one chipping away at the British control over India.
It reminds us that history isn't always neat and tidy. It's messy, complex, and often driven by things that are hard to define. So as we approach India's independence, we see the culmination of decades of struggle, sacrifice, and this unwavering commitment to freedom.
It's a story full of heroes and villains, triumphs and tragedies, a whole cast of characters that represent the full spectrum of human experience.
We've got the militant nationalists, the nonviolent resistors, the revolutionaries, the reformers. They all had a hand in shaping this incredible moment in history. Their stories remind us that the fight for freedom is never easy, never straightforward, and always complex. But despite the obstacles, despite the setbacks, India won its independence. It opened a new chapter in its long, long history.
And it's a story that still resonates with us today. It reminds us of the power of collective action, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the enduring legacy of those who fought for a better future.
It's been an amazing journey exploring this crucial period in India's history. We've learned so much from your source 13.pdf, and I hope this deep dive has inspired you to keep learning and exploring this fascinating subject. Thanks for joining us. This concludes the rewrite of the podcast. Please let me know if you need assistance with any other parts of the transcript.